Welcome to a true spiritual adventure story like the world has never known with your host, Dr. James Yogadi Weldon. Good day, this is Dr. Jim Weldon speaking to you from Heavenly Mountain in Boone, North Carolina. Our wonderful community here, which is dedicated to bridging the gaps in our understanding between the different traditions of the world and exploring the possibilities of human consciousness. This is an ongoing series on my third spiritual adventure novel entitled The Story Behind the Greatest Story Ever Told. I can understand it's completely surprising to most individuals. And the subtitle is Memories from the Life of Jesus. And I use that title because this is exactly how it happened. I'm really making no claims, but many years ago, in a superconscious state, which is more fully explained in my earlier books, Living the Enlightened Life and the Rise of the First World Teacher, I begin to see completely without any control whatsoever early details in a state experienced beyond consciousness, these events. And after a couple of days after they came out, I thought I should probably start writing this down. I had no idea what to do with it. That was over 10 years ago. And a certain portion of the story laid itself out step by step. And now at this time in my life, I'm continuing to tell the episodes from that story. So in this segment, we'll be entering the life of Jesus at a time where he is in India. He has spent a number of years there at this point, and he studied in the South, and he has found himself in one of the holiest spiritual centers of India, probably known at that time as Kashi, in modern day Banaras, known around the world as the city of the dead. It's really not the city of the dead, it's the city of the living, where spiritual seekers have come for ages, many, many thousands of years before even Jesus began his pilgrimage in this part of the world. Seekers of deeper knowledge had come. This is also the home of the arising of the teachings of Buddha. He made his first teachings in this region. And my teacher took me there, showed me some of these very, very old temples going back over 7,000 years. He said, this particular temple, they'd been doing prayers over 7,000 years. Amazed me. And also at that time took me to the spot, the place where the Buddha, it is said, enlightened many thousands of individuals. Some 10,000 individuals, it is said, I was told. And if you understand this story, you understand that our life is very deep and long. There's much we do not know about ourselves, our life. There's certainly a tremendous amount that we don't know about the life of Jesus, how he's trained, how he came to manifest such spiritual healing powers and insights during the very few short years of his life, only a short portion of his life, that was recorded and shared later in the Bible, and how that came about, I talked about in the very early chapters. And so at this time, he's made his way to the Kashi region, Banaras, and to some of the very early communities. And a lot of the fundamentals of those communities did remain. Of course, one of the difficulties is that when you have a such an enlightened being come into the world, those that follow are not of the same stature. They don't have the same insight. They don't have the premonitions. They don't have the foresight. They don't have the hindsight. Buddha began to teach. Really, his teaching was named, I was told, come and see, quote unquote, come and see. He didn't argue with anyone about what was true and was not true. Just come and sit with us in our community, in our Sangha, in our meditation groups, and just experience the silence, the stillness. And it was actually in that silence and stillness that much of the teaching occurred. And so after he passed, many of those teachers remained. Some of them traveled to different parts of the world. And the many branches of Buddhism emerged from that. Tibetan Buddhism did not even exist at that time. But Jesus was connected to this tradition. He believed and was just beginning to have the kind of insight to begin to peek back into those ancient times that he had been there at that time and was even training back then. You see, the maturing of the consciousness of the mind of man takes a long time. The body lasts a certain period of time. If you're lucky, 80 to 100 years. At that time, people lived less long. They lived longer in India. But in most of the world where Jesus grew up, life was quite short, very brutal. Perhaps 35, 40 years of old. Most people were considered to be old at that time. But in this culture, there was much more advanced sciences of health and healing. And he was benefiting by those sciences at this point in his life. Because in the journey to this region and traveling up the river ways, which are the pilgrimage pathways, he had actually fallen and fractured, broke, if you will, his right leg and had a deep cut on his left side. And for many individuals, something like this would either kill them or cause them to be debilitated, handicapped for the rest of their lives. But in India, they knew about splints, and so he had a splint on his leg. And he was actually at this time, for some months, confined mostly to bed with a bound splint on his leg in one of these hermitages along the water, where the priest would come down and do their offerings. And many of the monastic order, the Buddha, would watch, would come to pray and be in these communities. So the seekers for deeper knowledge were coming in from all parts of India, from many different places, and also overseas, because transportation now was very common for some individuals. And there were pilgrimages that were made from many parts of the world. Very few people from other parts of the world got this far, but there were a number of them that had come. And the young Master Jesus was one of these. And so there were two schools, major schools. There are many schools of spiritual knowledge in India. What we call traditional Hinduism is not one faith at all. Actually, that name Hindu was named from the Indus, which was generally the name of the peoples in this part of the world. There never has been, and there still isn't even today. Even though it's called Hinduism, it's many different teachings which are branched under that. But there are two basic schools of thought that had the predominance in that time, in that region. Those were following the teachings of Shaivism. We know this name Shiva. Shiva was seen as a being from sometime anciently in the past, perhaps a cosmic soul. This is the case. And Buddhism, Shaivism and Buddhism. And so the ceremonies for both of these in the meetings were held along the river. And the teachings were held along the river. And what had happened since the time of Buddha, and really it's happened since time before that, is that wealthy individuals in those regions, not wanting to undergo the difficulty of living in the forest and living in a sense homeless, seeking truth, would provide sanctuary and would donate money and property to support these communities as part of their good work. The whole concept of karma, of for every action, there's an equal opposite reaction, modern science. And then in Jesus' teachings, ultimately, that he took back to his home, as you sow, so shall you reap. And so he was influenced by both of these traditions, but more so by the Buddhist tradition. He felt connected with that. And one of the reasons he felt so connected with that tradition was because of his past relationship, which existed, in past times, ancient times, but also by the simplicity of it. Come and see, be in silence. Quiet the mind. And in that quieting process, experiencing the heaven within. And this ultimately became a major part of his teaching, obviously, when he traveled back to his home, which is now the modern Israel. The kingdom of heaven is within you. And our Father who art in heaven exists within us all. It's a very deep and profound truth. Very simple truth. This is also what got him into trouble later. Just this simple statement, and that the Father and I are one. You see, we all have a tendency to externalize our concepts of the divine, to say that whatever the divine is, God is some guy sitting in the clouds in some celestial place, looking down on us, making judgments. But he really liked the simplicity of Buddhism. So on one side, there would be one group, perhaps with a few hundred people doing different offerings. Of course, along the river, individuals would sit by the river in seclusion, who had given up all of their possessions, more or less. They're really supported by the community. At least food was provided, and if needed, in difficult times, shelter was provided during the cold weather for some of them. And so he would see that, and then he would see some of the students in the monastic orders, in the Buddhist order, sitting in silence. And many of these with, from time to time, big grins on their face. And so he knew that, yes, what was happening within. This is what he was really seeking. And so he was invited to join in one of these specific orders. They were holy places and spots where people met. And then, of course, certain things were created there, the stupas for the Buddhist tradition, which sometimes had relics of the Buddha. And you could travel around the region and go from place to place to place. One of the practices, of course, when you joined one of these orders, but you were in the first stage of the training. And some of these centers provided long-term ongoing support for their students. Individuals or small groups of monks, a teacher and some students, or several monks and friends often traveled together, living on the outskirts of these communities, practicing their meditation in the forest. And the different orders wanted to identify themselves. So they did so in an easy way by the color of their clothes. And this same color is what the young Jesus later in his life takes back to his homeland. And some of those early records show the reddish clothings which he is said to have worn then. It's talked about in a few places. And another thing that many of these students had were prayer beads given to them as part of their joining the order. And these could be used as part of the meditation. And that continued down to modern times in the church with the prayer beads. And even today, that's done. So each time you would move your finger on the prayer bead, a prayer would be said, or a mantra would be said. It was a practice, and it could be done with the eyes opening while moving. So if they're walking some long distance on a trip, silently the group in the community would move through the forest along pathways which were now pretty well established, doing this inward meditation at the same time they were walking. There's a whole science to this, which is still available today. Breathing and walking, meditation and walking. The inner state could be maintained. And then they would stop for the night at another one of these centers, monasteries, where people were living part-time, full-time, and listen to the teachings and have discussions. And even to today, up in modern Tibet, one of the teachings of the young students is to do discourses and to argue different points of view. And so as part of their education, one person would take one point of view, another person would take another point of view, and they would present their arguments pro and con. And part of this was not to ferret the truth through words, because an argument can be made for any point of view. Don't we know? In our world today, an argument could be made, but there is truth underlying that. And it was well recognized that individuals could get stuck in a particular point of view, regardless of what it is. See, for the truth of life to be known, it's not expressed in words. All the wisdom and all the knowledge contained in all the books of the Bible, all the books that Buddha shared, all of the writings on Shaivism and other tradition, that knowledge stays in the books. The intellectual idea of what is and what is not true is not known there. It's known by hearing some of these deeper insights, hopefully from a highly developed being, and then taking these insights inside and discovering their essences in the living reality of the deeper realms of our existence. You see, because if the insight is that life is one, we can say that till the end of time and continue with the firm conviction that that's true. But of course, the experience is that I'm here and you are there. And the world is very different from me. This is the phase that he was passing into a more cosmic understanding at this point in his life, at this time in his life. The reality of an underlying existence that connects us all is not one which is achieved through any number of discussions. And this is why Buddha didn't have hardly any discussions. Some of the top teachers would come to see him. He wouldn't argue at all. When we think of the Buddha, we think of someone standing in sublime peace, in a imminent contentment in fulfillment. And the secret waves of that vibration of contentment, of fulfillment, penetrated the knots of separateness, if you will, and gradually over time begin to unravel those. In very much sense, it's like taking a dip in the ocean. We can sit on the beach and talk forever about what the ocean is and how vast it is, and what's on the other side of the ocean and what might be on the other side of the ocean. In other words, what happens when you die, what happens and what great kingdoms might exist over there, what kingdoms may not exist, what happens to you if you're good, what happens to you if you're not so good. Do you descend to a lower realm? All of this, we can discuss all of this forever. But in order to know this, to really know it, not just to think it, to believe it, one has to pass into the ocean and over the ocean, in this sense, becoming part of that, to that other side. And so the other side of that ocean is the connectedness of all. Was essentially at the heart of his teaching. And what appealed to Jesus so much. And so this was his life now. And fortunately, he was learning to trust. You see, later what goes back to India, I'm sorry. So later what goes back to his homeland is a compilation of his insights, along with something unbelievable that happens, an unbelievable arrival of a great force within him at the time when he meets up with John the Baptist, who has been talking about something amazing happening, something coming. I'll talk about that later in the story. But this time here just continues to help him formulate those points of view. And then also he learns very directly and really to live very simply, without much. And of course, because he has such tremendous empathy for others. And of course, because he has such tremendous empathy for others, in this community, everybody shares what they have. And then also individuals are coming to these sanghas that have more, some of the wealthy individuals, and they give what they can. So a mother nearby with her children and her family cooks dinner, but she makes twice as much. And then after everybody eats, they go out. And then after everybody eats, they go out and meet some of these traveling seekers to offer. It was a lot easier by this time than it was at the time of Buddha, because Buddha took some of the very wealthy, sophisticated leaders of many of the cultures. They were princes of the state that came to him for teaching. Imagine living in a princely castle like he had been near for all of your life, and to come for Buddha and commit to the teaching and then be asked to shed all your clothes, abandon your wealth, and to take a bowl and go out, and hopefully someone would give you enough to eat that night. It was a difficult lesson for them. So by this time, obviously, a few hundred years later, it was much easier. You didn't even need to ask. If you would come into a place, if you had a bowl out, someone would come by and put some food in there. Tasty. So this was the life that he was living. No responsibilities, just spending time in looking into the teachings of these different traditions, and very deeply the Buddhist tradition, because he felt it connected with him very deeply, and it did for very specific reasons. And this all happened some months after he arrived, because he needed a number of months to sit and heal the fracture, the broken leg that he had passed through. So these were some of the deep teachings. And this wasn't like a traditional church organization where the answers to everything were passed down. You see, in the Buddhist tradition, there was really no central authority. That was happening at this time, but initially. And there was openness to many different varieties of practice and philosophy. There were lineages, obviously, by this time that were well established. So the senior teachers, and both male and female at this time, had moved into roles. They were expected to help preserve the initial teaching and provide a certain amount of discipline in the communities, what was expected. And they were meant to provide a living example for the community as well. And the center became a place where people were given the opportunity to earn merit by giving gifts and supporting the monks and the teachers. And in return for this support, the students were expected to live a austere life. They would be forced on, they were expected to live an austere life, focused on the study of the teachings and practice of meditation, and to live a high moral character. So this was the life that Jesus was living during this time. And and it went on for some years. So from this point, some conflict did arise with Jesus and some of the other community members and some of the different sects, because he traveled around and learned from many different groups. And we'll talk about that. A circumstance was being created for him essentially to make his move from this location. So we'll see what happens in the next round, the next episode. I'm never quite sure until it begins to come into that space that I talked about earlier, Turiya. So join me again in the ongoing saga, true spiritual adventure story of Jesus, who was being prepared to be an embodiment of this truth, to bring a force of goodness, of healing, of release of suffering to many individuals in his culture. Also, we don't have an understanding that we are connected genetically and energetically with our entire culture. So this training and what he was going through also was already beginning to produce an effect, certainly in his family, but also in his community in an unseen way. We'll talk about how that happens later. This is Dr. Jim Weldon speaking from Heavenly Mountain in Boone, North Carolina, a community which is dedicated to bridging the gap between the different spiritual traditions of the world and helping individuals live the reality of the life, of the existence, of the being, of the divinity behind all the great teachings of the world. We'll talk to you again. So long till then.